As soon as we say that growth is the mission, we kind of show that we don't know what we're talking about, because growth is the result. Who doesn't want to grow? I don't know any country that would say, oh, we don't have a growth mission. Literally. So you have to start with the investment, get it right with the right conditionality. And if it works, you're going to increase public and private investment, which are the key foundations of growth.
This episode is presented by NatWest. Now, many great startup ideas often don't get past day one, not because they're flawed, but because the first steps feel too hard. Well, NatWest Business understands that, because they've helped more businesses get started than any other British bank. So they make those first steps easier by giving you 2 years free banking on your everyday transactions. Whatever your idea, it doesn't have to be perfect. Just start. Search NatWest Business Accounts. Specific account and service eligibility criteria apply. Other fees may be applicable. Sourcing from NatWest Group Results Q2 2025 Savanta Market View Survey.
Hello and welcome to The Rest is Money with me, Robert Peston.
And me, Steph McGovern. And also with us today, a podcast friend of ours, Mariana Mazzucato, who, as you know, is brilliant on all things economics. She's a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London. She's author of Mission Economy, a Moonshot guide to changing capitalism, and she advised the Labour government on their mission-led approach. So a person we love talking to, and we always have loads to talk to her about, don't we, Robert?
We do. And as you say, I think what she's most famous for is this concept of missions, how you drive economies by setting goals in certain ways. And she actually said on this podcast before that although Keir Starmer, no less, the Prime Minister, bigged up her mission approach, she thinks he doesn't really get it and hasn't really implemented it properly. Anyway, she always has absolutely compelling things to say, actually about economies of almost any country you can think of, because she spends quite a lot of her time advising world leaders. So today we're going to talk to her about the challenge set to all of us by Trump and the specific problems being faced by all of us in this country. So here's our chat with Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana, there's always way too much to talk to you about. I thought I'd actually kick off with a piece that you wrote a little earlier this year where you talked about how to challenge populism. And this is obviously very topical at the moment, given that Nigel Farage appears to be making the running in this country, particularly when it comes to immigration and how to approach the problem of large numbers of people endangering their lives by coming across the channel in small boats. And I just wondered, having thought about this, if you were advising whether it was Starmer or even perhaps Kemi Badenoch, or rather the leaders of what people call the mainstream parties, how would you recommend that they confront a Farage challenge on this very resonant issue?
Right. Well, big question to open up with. On a very broad point, I'd say that somehow the right, globally, the extreme right, in fact, the kind of xenophobic side of the conservative right has been very good at very simplistic messages that are put out there in moments where people are feeling a lot of pain. And it's not that people are stupid that they believe simplistic messages, but if on the other side we have complex messages or no vision or no story, that it becomes very hard to combat that level of populism. And I think what progressives should learn to do is to have simple but not simplistic messages. I don't think we have good, strong, simple messages based on, I could use the word truth, but, what is the truth? But, evidence of what is actually causing the harm, the pain that people feel in terms of the economy. I mean, the fact that, for example, in the UK, there's so much talk about the public sector, the public debt, and all this talk about the fiscal rules, so on and so forth, when the actual problem is the private sector. Like just that very simple message that we have an economy that has allowed the private sector to earn profits, which are not then invested into the economy, that are basically given out to shareholders. Just look at the Thames Water problem or the Carillion kind of model of corporate governance. That's a simple message that I have not heard, for example, from Keir Starmer or the progressives. And that's something that then is not about us versus them. I'm not one to like us versus them. It's not about the state versus the private sector, national citizens versus immigrants. It's always about a view, a lens that turns into a story that's simple and understandable of what we think is actually causing, for example, the lack of investment, the lack of wages rising with productivity in the last 30 years, the fact that we have, capital is very well organized, labor is increasingly not organized. We have big ownership structures. It's really funny to hear UK leaders on both the left and the right talk about Singapore when 80% of the land in Singapore is owned by the state. And so just think of the financial crisis having been caused basically by a real estate boom, and the fact that in this country, another part of the simple story should be 80% of our finance goes back to finance. It doesn't even hit the real economy. The fact that we use images of Singapore, but then have such a different economy from theirs because we have financialized our economy, both in the sense that I mentioned before of corporate governance, but also the financial sector. The financial sector puts most of its money in finance, insurance, and real estate. And that's what leads to housing bubbles and what leads to financial bubbles. And we don't hear that simple story that allows people to feel the strength to understand the economy and not just have fear of, immigrants and so on.
I think about this a lot, Mariana, because of where I am from and where I grew up is often the place where this populism takes hold. It's, with Brexit and things in the northeast of England, that's where the term came, the Tories taking the red wall and things like that. And there is there's a working class disenchantment here. But I often think about whether a government can ever really change that and make working class people feel better off, because that's essentially what's needed in order to make, them feel like they're not being left behind. Because, when policies are made, it's often leads to the wealth staying amongst the few. Political decisions are often skewed towards the people most likely to vote for a party or the ones with the most power in terms of their impact on things in the economy. And that's not often the poorest people or the working class. So things then don't get better for them. So, the kind of short-termism in politics means that they even if this populism takes hold and if reform get in the next election, it's based on the fact that working class people are feeling like things aren't any better. But reform, as things stand, are not economically credible, so things are unlikely to improve again for the working class because the money stays amongst the few and the rich and the powerful. So then it'll just flip again, and it's like it doesn't ever feel like it's getting better for people, and that's part of the problem here. It's that short-termism, isn't it?
So I think what you raise is really important because there's kind of two or three different issues there. One is, and this is really relevant for what we saw in the US, that even when the reforms do benefit working people, if we don't have, again, a narrative, but even an attempt to speak directly to people, the humbleness, even just to listen, and instead of just telling everyone, hey, this, fiscal stimulus, say the IRA in the US, Inflation Reduction Act, has had a great effect on jobs, wages, and investment, which, by the way, it did. You don't just tell people that. You make them feel part of a movement, a reform, a period. And what happened in the US is there was very little. This is why I mentioned, I started off with the whole thing about being simple and not simplistic. There was very little speaking with people or making them feel part of something that, might take time, because sometimes these figures, like the time it takes for an investment stimulus to actually hit and to land with new jobs and higher wages, it may take time. And during that time, you want to be explaining to people why you've done what you've done and maybe even how long it will take to make their own communities feel better. But beyond that, you also have to make them feel part of it. Like, what is it for? What kind of society do we want? And obviously, Trump won for all sorts of different reasons. But I do think that's one of the reasons. And I remember before he won, even when the data was looking quite good, actually, for the Biden economy, there was interviews asking people why they were going to vote for Trump. And a couple of them just really struck me. It was like people in the bar saying, well, if I sat down with Trump today, he would understand me. He would listen to me. And we know that's not true. Trump is very good at, portraying himself like that, the people's man, when actually everything he's done is what you talked about, making the rich richer, reducing tax, financializing the economy, and so on. Making it easier for people just to start up companies just to get benefits, and then you purposefully make it go bankrupt and start another one, so on and so forth. But he did have a story that made people feel that they were listened to. And we need to, again, go beyond the stories. We need proper economic policy. We need messaging around that. But if we don't even have, if we just have big intellectual debates on the news or in academia and the so-called elite, which itself is a problem in terms of how we talk about it. But anyway, and don't have a movement, it can't just be a political party. It can't just be a progressive agenda. Ultimately, it has to be a movement. If you look at Roosevelt, I think it's so interesting during the economic recovery after the Great Crash. I mean, he really created a movement, even bringing artists, designers, poets into the recovery. That was about culture. And ultimately, culture is about messaging. It's about the story. What kind of society do we want to live in? What's it all for? He set up a whole national park program, not just, save the planet. It was national parks are good for people. People, all sorts of people of different classes deserve to have lots of green space around them and to enter those places served by public purpose. What is the equivalent of that today? What is the equivalent of the weekend? The labor movement fought for a weekend. Saturdays and Sundays were fought for. People died to give us all weekends, holidays and so on. What's the equivalent of that today in the labor movement, right? So I do think there's some big stuff that we're not talking about. And when, again, the so-called working class, I don't want to put everyone in a bucket just calling them working class, but the people that you're talking about who haven't seen the real wages rise, have seen a lot of, the ghost town problem that the specials talked about back then, which is still a problem in terms of certain places completely being left behind. When that's all they're experiencing, and then the aggregate figures look like, wages might be going up, jobs are going up and so on, but their own lives don't feel much better and they don't feel valued. Literally, they don't have the dignity. They don't feel valued by the intelligentsia themselves, let alone others. Then I think we have a huge problem.
I mean, to your point about the importance of the message, to an extent, Trump has a sort of genius in terms of saying things that tap into the concerns of people who've been left behind. So at odds, the reality of what he's actually done. I mean, there's a paper out just now by, Size, Yagan, Zuckman and Bolkier looking at the tax paid by billionaires in America. And as a result of Trump's tax policies, first time round, that are being sustained, the tax rate paid by billionaires in America fell from 30% to 24% and is significantly below the tax paid by most working people in America. So there he is rewarding, to an astonishing extent, billionaires. And yet the message that members of, what in this country would be called the working class, in America would be called the middle class, the message they hear is that he's on their side. And then he does do sort of gestural politics that looks to an extent like he's on their side. So take the recent, whatever it was, 9-10 billion grant under actually a Biden program to the chip maker Intel. It would have been a pure grant under Biden. Trump has insisted that the state gets a 10% stake in return for that money, which is something that Biden himself was plainly too frightened to do because he didn't want to look like a socialist. And so he does have this sort of genius for tapping into, or just being pragmatic in a way that makes it look, even if he's not, as though he's on the side of everybody.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's that joke that when someone just talks a lot statistically, there's going to be a higher chance that something is right. I mean, I actually don't think that applies to him. But, he has said some interesting things also completely off topics, like that that Amazon, the delivery part of Amazon, is abusing the National Post Office. So just coming back to your specific point, which is interesting, by the way, because I worked on the CHIPS Act with Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, and we made sure that that act actually had really good progressive conditions, that the companies benefiting from this massive grant were held accountable and were improving working conditions, were limiting share buybacks. In fact, it was no share buybacks. So if you're getting money from the government and making profits from that, you have to reinvest that profit back into productive capacity, not just giving it out to shareholders, and the use of energy efficient supply chains and so on. He's taken all that away. So he's taking away that progressive conditionality. But as you say, then comes up with this great idea, which, I actually wrote about this back in 2011 and 2013, under the entrepreneurial state, what it means for the state to take equity. In fact, I've gotten about 30 messages in the last month about, hey, what do you think about Trump's plan? It depends. I mean, everything depends how you do it. If it's just taking 10% and then managing that really poorly, I would argue that many state-owned enterprises, even today, that are almost all state-owned or partly state-owned, look at Enel in my own country, in Italy, it's something like 23% owned by the government, but the government doesn't do anything with it. There's no vision of why you would need an energy company in Italy in terms of the transformative capacity that they used to have back in the day in the 1930s, when the company, unfortunately, was under Mussolini. Not a great day in Italy's history, but still, they had a vision of using that stake to industrialize Italy. In fact, Eric Hobsbawm, in A Great History of the World, basically talks about China and Italy as the two countries that most quickly went from an agricultural society to an industrial society because of this kind of vision, plan, development policy, and using their state-owned enterprises. For example, in Italy, they constructed the motorway called Autostrada del Sole, the motorway of the sun, from the north of the boot to the south of the boot in just 4 years. It's a huge feat, right? So having equity stakes in a company like that, an energy company, the infrastructure company, in that case, it was an infrastructure company called EDI, to help development, transformative capacity in the country. That's one thing. If it's just equity stakes that Trump gets, puts it in the treasury, and then uses that to give out money in a dysfunctional way to companies, that's not necessarily progressive. However, as you say, the gimmick, the idea about using it and having a narrative, coming back to my first point, just very simplistic stories that people are like, oh yeah, that's such a good idea. He's very good at that. And what he's also good at, ironically, is what a lot of comedians are good at. And think of Zelensky, he was a comedian, or Beppe Grillo, he was a comedian. In Italy, he set up the 5-Star Movement. They rose up in both those countries, very different histories. In Italy, Beppe Grillo and the 5-Star Movement rose up just slinging mud, just saying how bad everything was, the swamp kind of rhetoric that Trump had with Hillary Clinton and so on. That's what he's really good at. So he's good at just kind of blaming, saying everything is terrible, and then, here's my solution. And when, coming back to the discussion before, when people are feeling so much pain, they do think everything's terrible. And then if the solutions, though, are just gimmicks, right? Some really problematic gimmicks like the tax policies, which then he spins in a different way, but also these ideas of, equity stake or, we're going to build up the working class again by forcing companies to go to Detroit instead of leaving Detroit. That's not going to happen.
It's interesting you say that point, though, about slinging mud, because it feels like we're really good at that here. Like, you're constantly hearing Labour slagging off the Tories for the inheritance and everything else. But what we don't do here, which I think Trump does well, is talk about the positive and actually, and sometimes it's obviously not in truth because he's saying we're doing brilliant and we're going to do all these amazing things, and the reality and the economics don't stand up to that. But it makes people feel like they are part of a movement that is positive, and it's that, I guess it's like the blagging it, isn't it? It's so blag it until you feel it, and we're not very good at that. We don't do the building us up and telling us things are great.
Exactly, but also I don't think actually Labour has done a good job in slinging proper mud. In other words, if you look at, what they should have done, I think, is, said it once, basically. Not actually once, but, a certain amount of time, and then stop talking about it, but said it well. So the effect of austerity and the effect of Brexit have both been disastrous for this country. And we don't have to repeat the stats here, but there are very good figures showing how terrible both those things were. 14 years of austerity and then the Brexit, I think your colleague on the Rest is Politics calls it NASH, the National Act of Self-Harm. Anyway, massive self-harm done to this country. We don't have to go down that discussion, but definitely those two things should have and could every now and then at the right moment, not in a dispersed constant moaning, but in the right moments, just remind everyone just how terrible their policies were. And then what we don't hear is how good or how inspirational or, what great opportunities there are right now for the next 5 years, 10 years in this country if we get the solutions right. And that positive story that requires a national vision around, health, around digital and AI, but not AI, just superpower, but what it's actually going to mean for people's lives. So reducing also the digital divide, but also making sure that, we reduce the massive divide in terms of educational attainments in this country and the role of AI in helping that instead of hurting that if it's governed properly. And definitely net zero, what it means for creating new jobs, new skills, and making, again, people feel part of that. I think I mentioned before in your podcast that the only place I really have sensed that positivity was in my work for 2 years with Camden Council when Georgia Gould was the leader of Camden Council. We worked very closely on kind of Camden-specific missions, including a net zero one that was done with people in, the halls, resident halls. It was about transforming food banks to food cooperatives, green food cooperatives. And, you can understand how someone walking into a food bank will, for certain reasons, not feel that great about themselves walking into a food cooperative when they are part of that. They own it. They have the dignity. They feel valued. Same amount of food given to them, right? So same end result, but they're part of the second, not part of the first. They feel a bit like, things are done sort of at them and they're not part of it. So coming back to that point before they made about Biden, where even though when things are somehow working, but people don't feel part of it, that kind of really matters. And I think we haven't had a vision, a strategic vision in terms of increasing investment. We continue to have lower public investment than the rest of the G7. Had we invested half of what the G7 invested in the last decades, it would have been like something like 500 billion more. Over the last decade, we haven't caught up to that lack of investment. If anything, we're, again, posing another kind of self-harm, not the Brexit one, but the very problematic fiscal rules that this country has set itself. So that the actual lack of a strategy right now means that they go back to having to attract capital. So by that, I mean business, global business, with very problematic kind of, again, gimmicks, whether it's around just talking about getting rid of some planning measures, specific tax policies, but especially with, say, the Palantir and the, attempt to attract AI companies to this country without actually governing that relationship in a way that promises to be good for not just the economy, but literally for people's privacy and so on. It's a huge issue. So what you want to do is to attract capital, attract business to the UK, because they're going to feel like this is the coolest place to be, to develop new skills, to work with government, to work with other companies, small, medium, and large, around achieving certain goals. And if we look at why that's important, most countries, even small ones like Denmark, have actually developed really competitive sectors through actually having a vision by helping small companies scale. It's not about, romanticizing small companies. You want startups to scale up, not just start. Otherwise, what's the point? And in Denmark, they are today the number one providers to China of high-tech green digital services, which were developed by Copenhagen wanting to be the greenest city in the world. And then the city ended up using, or, if you want, working with those startups that had begun in the usual way that startups like to be in dynamic cities like London and Copenhagen, but in some they grow, some they don't. And they grew through the demand side tools that the city had, but also by working in a functional way with their national champion in the wind sector, which is called Vestas. And we don't have that same kind of industrial strategy that looks at, here's our goals, whether it's net zero or health and well-being. Here's how we're going to use that strategy to develop both supply side and demand side tools like public sector procurement, which is 30% often of government budgets, which can be used like the U.S. government has always used it in the defense sector. So the chip makers were, scaled up through the U.S. government purchasing a massive amount of semiconductor chips almost half a century ago. That's why we ended up with Moore's Law, this massive reduction in the cost of chip making. And so using all the different levers government have, from public loans to procurement, even to bailouts during COVID, to help steer an economy in a direction. And as soon as we say that growth is that direction, growth is the mission, we kind of show that we don't know what we're talking about, because growth is the result. Like in the case of Denmark, they will grow if they are able to actually achieve those contracts, say with the Chinese government. They will grow if they are able to scale their small companies. They will grow if the procurement contracts for sustainable mobility across their whole infrastructure program is able to foster new innovation, new training, new investment. So you have to start with the investment, get it right with the right conditionality, like Biden tried to do with the CHIPS Act. And if it works, you're going to increase public and private investment, which are the key foundations of growth. You don't grow without investment. But starting always with the growth narrative, who doesn't want to grow? I don't know any country that would say, oh, we don't have a growth mission, literally. And in fact, if that's all you talk about, you probably won't grow, because it shows you don't really know what drives growth, which is the kind of dynamics I just mentioned.
I think this is probably a moment when we need to go to a quick break, but let's pick up on those themes in just a minute.
Welcome back to The Rest is Money. We're mid-chat with Mariana. And one of the things you said before the break that really stands out to me, and everything you talk about, the mission-driven way we should look at life, is you need collaboration. And you've obviously given great examples of where that's worked, like, for example, in Camden and things like that. But I just don't think we're very good at collaboration. I think we pay a lot of lip service to it. But when it comes down to it, inevitably, people do what's best for them, and whether that's best for them personally or best for them in their company or their department, if it's a government department, whatever. And if you're a politician, you're towing the party line. So you might have really great ideas that have come from your local community about how to drive change. But in order to get higher up in the political party, you've got to toe the line. And that might mean giving up on some things you care about. So it's not coming from a place of selfishness. It's more that I think when it comes down to it, the measurements we have in life that tell us whether we're good or successful, or whether we keep our job, or whether we get to the next level in education, standardize us and just make us all the same rather than different.
Even when you have the right intentions, and most of the people I've met globally who are in government actually have good intentions, and they've gone there notwithstanding the lower pay, notwithstanding the constant attacks. Yes, there's corruption, but I'm talking about the people, whether it's Georgia Gould and Camden, whether it's, President Lula, whether it's Mia Mottley, the head of the Barbados government, and the people that work for her that I've met and worked very closely to. I've only seen people who, notwithstanding all sorts of problems, are trying their hardest to make it good for society. However, then exactly what you said happens, which is unless that vision, that mission, that public purpose, set up a whole institute called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, unless that's matched with a change in the system, a change in the metrics, literally how the Treasury, for example, evaluates public investment in a green book, then you're not going to be able to fulfill your promise. So I wrote about this in my book, Mission Economy, which, as you know, I think we talked about in our last time together on the podcast, Keir Starmer kindly cites, but, we also talked about whether missions are actually rigorously being used in this country. What I wrote about there was that with defense-related missions, because we take them seriously, right? No one says, oh, let's go to war. Okay, let's win in 30 years. Let's, give it a long time. So here's a bit of money. Go play and come back and give us your KPIs. You want to win the war, right? So all the things we did in COVID, like advanced purchase agreements, very clear missions in terms of timelines for when we want the vaccine out, conditionality like we had with AstraZeneca and the Oxford University researchers, which wasn't just, oh, go and collaborate. It was collaborate in a particular way to keep costs and prices down, share the knowledge, so on and so forth. We we know how to do it with war because people have urgency with war. There's clear goals with war. But with societal challenges, whether it's reducing obesity, whether it's net zero, whether it's knife crime in London, we're just so fuzzy. And then, so not only not taking them seriously with clear urgency and timelines, but also we then end up implementing these very static kind of economic metrics, not just the KPIs, but the way we measure success is very problematic. So with the moon landing, as I mentioned in the book, even if that lunar module had exploded just before getting to the moon, which it didn't, some people say that it never happened, but let's not go to the conspiracists.
Please, let's not go there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, given, Trump's craziness, who knows what he would say. But even if they had not gotten to the moon, you could actually measure it as a successful mission, given how they structured it along the way with this outcomes orientation, because they were using the mission-oriented approach to solve problems like what would the astronauts wear, how would they go to the bathroom, what would they eat, how would they eat it. And so in solving all those problems along the way, we ended up with these enormous amounts of innovations like camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, software, so on and so forth. So that's about dynamic spillovers along the way to fulfilling a mission. So if you truly are bringing urgency with deadlines, collaborating between public, private, and other actors to solve problems, then you better have a way to measure whether along the way you're generating that kind of economy-wide effect and spillovers. Instead, if we just use cost-benefit analysis, net present value, and very static metrics, even when you're being successful, you don't know how to evaluate it, and chances are then you stop the program or just structure it wrongly in the first place because you're not actually going after those, benefit effects across all sorts of sectors. And, that's really key for government. They need to work with all sectors, not just have their national champion sector like AI, life sciences. You want all sectors, transport, materials, cement and steel need to change. The steel industry should change if we have a net zero strategy.
The example that I've got on that very thing, which is kind of my big beef, is we had the GCSE results come out in the last couple of weeks, and there's a noticeable difference between the North and the South. And similarly, we've had, Michael Marmot on the show talking about life expectancy in the North is lower than the South, even when the level of the deprivation is the same. And, you hear this kind of narrative of, maybe the teachers aren't as good in the North, maybe the schools aren't as good. And I completely disagree with that. I think the big problem here is the opportunity is different. So in the South, there's a greater access for, yes, you might be from this, the same poverty as someone in the North, but there's more theatre tickets that are free. There's cultural experiences that the young people there can have that they can't get in the North. There's more businesses who are open to taking on work experience. And so the big difference is opportunity. But yet we put these young people through the exact same test as a way of comparing them, this standardized testing, which doesn't actually measure them on an equal footing because they've not got an equal chance to be able to do well at them, because we all know the extracurricular stuff you do around exams and the structure you need at home and things like that means you can do better in it. And if you haven't got that in the North, that's why they're not doing as well. It's nothing to do with, it might be a little bit to do with teachers and schools, but that's not the crux of it. And yet when we try and solve these problems, I think we're not thinking in the right way about it, and yet making these comparisons that can be life-changing for people. It's telling you at 16 whether you're going to do well or not in life, and it's completely wrong.
That's a really good point about the difference in opportunities, but I've seen it as well in Camden. The state system here, the state schools, my 4 children went through the state system throughout their education, and those kids in their classes who did not have the same opportunities they did for socioeconomic reasons are often left behind. And when the same state schools allow themselves to get gamed so that you have these privately educated boys, for example, coming to a girls' state school just for the last 2 years in the sixth form to be considered state educated by Oxford and Cambridge. This is all part of that problem. So if we actually care about solving the opportunity issue, there's, ways to do that would also massively reduce inequality in a place like Camden, and even more so, as you say, from the North and the South. But it actually sort of connects, because you mentioned the theater tickets, to the issue around network externalities and this clustering effect that we were talking about before. I think the only example of successful example in the UK of trying to get the North and the South a bit more predictable, if you want, in terms of economic prospects, was the BBC move to Salford. I mean, literally, like all these other programs that seem to be like, just talking about leveling up, but actually not paying attention to what is that way that you actually build a skills pool and get people to want to move, even though maybe they didn't want to move there. But anyway, to start getting that kind of dynamic effect of the kind that we were talking about, it just hasn't worked. Like all the local, what were they called back then? LEPs or LEMs, and then these kind of regional venture capital. Yeah, they didn't really work.
I was one of the BBC journalists who did that move. So I went from London working for BBC National News. I think people always assume because of my accent that I started regionally, but I didn't. I started with Robert Peston and then went on to Telly myself. And I moved with BBC Breakfast from London to Salford. And you're right, it's really dramatically changed things in Salford. There's loads of great independent production companies there. There's a real kind of media setup. But what was interesting is when I moved there, one of the big bosses at the BBC, who shall remain nameless, said to me, "Oh, great, you're going home. There's going to be loads more opportunity for people, from where you're from." I'm from the northeast of England. That is a good cover. It's faster for me to get from Middlesbrough to London than it is Middlesbrough to Manchester. I think, yes, you're right. That totally localised made a big difference in the Manchester area, but that doesn't solve the north problem. And that's the thing. I think then big organisations go, right, well, we've done the north now. That's that sorted. Let's move on to that. And so, but you're right. It did make a big difference.
I didn't mean that that's the solution. I just meant even that little microcosm as a sandbox, one could say. If you then multiply that across all sorts of different areas, not just public broadcasting, and take it seriously, anyway, I just don't think we've ever done it properly. And we continue to talk all about things like leveling up. In some countries, like in Brazil, the north is poor, by the way. In Italy, the south is poor. And yet in Italy is a great example. We have all sorts of policies that have tried to get businesses to move to the south. It's called Cassa del Mezzogiorno. It sounds great. Everything in Italian sounds good. So Fiat will get a huge grant from the government to set up a factory in the south, but all the knowledge remains up north. All the R&D remained up north in Turin. You don't need a big econometric equation to tell you that's not going to work. So how do you move knowledge hubs, right? And the research and the science industry links and all the skills formations and properly done apprenticeships and, really thinking about local youth and putting them through kind of a pipeline of really exciting projects linked to, for example, an AI and data strategy and having a data commons. I mean, just think of the George the Poet, by the way, one of my PhD students who you might know, George Mapanga, who's a Peabody Award-winning podcaster. He says that, he was given for his podcast by the BBC, their whole archive, or given access to it. And he said, that should be in the public domain in our public libraries. I mean, imagine if we actually had, this is a separate passion of mine, a British library that, yeah, fine, it's in the southeast, it's in London, but actually has its tentacles, proper tentacles all over the country, right? And you have a public library system that's not just at best where people go to do their homework because they have no space in their home, but is literally the repository of the data commons. It becomes the coolest place where you can learn how to do podcasts like your own, how to, basically level up as an individual and be nourished at the level of your soul by books, by music, by the data commons and so on. And to have it all kind of, if you want, supervised or coordinated, I could say, from the British Library in London, but that the real impact is all over the country. That's not what we have. If, at best we have libraries not being cut, being saved, because what we've had with austerity is a lot of public libraries dying. But that's not enough just to have a youth center or have a public library. They need to be valued and put at the center of what we think is a prosperous economy. And given that in the north, they, also have more people working in the public sector than the private sector, that's often a sign of lack of dynamism. We can reverse that. We can make those public services be some of the most dynamic public services. I often give the example of school meals, partly also because Marcus Rashford was up north on the Manchester team. And he so importantly reminded us all during COVID how important free breakfast and free school meals are for young footballers like himself, who would never have become an athlete had he not had literally that good food. But that can't just be seen as a welfare policy. You turn that into an innovation policy by making it mission-oriented, making sure that everyone has access to sustainable, tasty, healthy school meals. And all of a sudden, the procurement, the demand-side contracts that I was talking about before with the private sector can become, again, much more ambitious. We can use local food manufacturers. We can have training. We can have kids also involved in learning about healthy, tasty, sustainable school meals throughout the curriculum. And all of a sudden, something that, when it's done badly, is at best a welfare policy, becomes an innovation policy that allows small companies to scale because they're part of this really dynamic public program, and parts of the country that, have more public workers than themselves become part of an innovation agenda instead of, not.
That was fascinating as always, Mariana. Thank you so much for joining us. And that's it from The Rest is Money. See you soon.
Bye-bye.